phone now.
Okay.
Will connect through the computer hocam. Okay, you can continue. I hear you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Today I'm presenting you aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and the impact to the Keynesian economics, comparing with the model, and enlarge it to the components for being able to understand how it is going to affect and change the variables, and what causes to these shifts on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply will be introduced to you. Step by step, I'm going to create and build the model, and then after this theoretical introduction and explanations, then I will give you some applications regarding to Keynesian economics, and then go to solo growth model. Okay. Aggregate supply and aggregate demand, as you know, supply and demand curves are directly related with the production and the consumption. And we are talking about in macroeconomics the aggregate supply and demand, which is related to the nation's level demand and activities in the consumption, so-called the demand capacity of the economy. And we will then go after this introductory part of the aggregate supply and demand, and go to the shifts on the aggregate supply and demand, and the causes of these shifts to the inflation and to the other parameters which is affecting interest rate, because as much as inflation is in the economy, in the market, then this will then affect other parameters. As you know, inflation, interest rate, nominal interest rate, these are all is becoming affected. Exchange rate, appreciation, depreciation of the currency, these are all very important parameters which is heavily affecting and changing the whole economy. As you know, as much as the price changes increase and enlarge, this will also affect the employment. If you know the Phillips curve, the relationship between the inflation and the unemployment is also very important and very popular issue, whether the minimum wage shifted up and down and how it is affecting and changing the market structure is also in the, let's say, agenda. And it is very important for being able to understand the impact of the inflation to the economy, and the, let's say, as a multiplier effect to the other parameters such as nominal interest rate, real interest rate, exchange rate, export, import, balance of payments. These are all affected, and employment, unemployment, these things are becoming very affected from inflation. And from this point of view, the demand side and supply side of the, of course, we are talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, is very heavily affecting and changing the whole system. If there is any recession or any demand reduction or decline demand or reducing the demand or any reduction in the demand, this will then cause some recessionary period, and results of this then aggregate supply or the supply side will then will be affected again, and this is not good for the whole economy. And as it is written here, the supply side and the demand is also going to be questioned in this lecture. And then the government implications or the effects, the political influence or the political regulations, and the so-called central bank policies will be then introduced you briefly, which is going to be extended to the coming chapters. Okay. The aggregate demand, if we are going to define it, this is then the amounts of real domestic output which domestic consumers, businesses, governments, and foreign buyers collectively will desire to purchase at each possible price level. Therefore, aggregate demand is very heavily affected from the price changes or the inflation. If the inflation is in the market, the welfare, the consumer welfare, is supposed to be affected and reduced. And vice versa is also possible. The aggregate demand is positively affected if the price level is going downwards. And this is important to know. Inflation is not good for the long run as well as in the short run. There are some positive effects as it is supposed to be, but this is in the question and in the discussion topics whether it is good or not, because since we are in the global platform and international market and we are all requiring foreign inputs, foreign energy, increasing the price level or shifting the inflation to the higher level for deliberately devaluating or just because of the market structure, increasing the inflation or increase on the price level or rising the price level in the market is heavily affecting the whole parameters and the whole economy. Because, as I said to you, when the price is going up, not only demand is reduced or the recession is observed in the demand, but also supply is also affected, because it is believed that when prices, especially in the short run, is shifted to the upper level, this will then create some spaces to the producers for selling their exportable goods to the foreigners, to the international markets with lower price and with cheaper, let's say, purchasing capacity for the foreigners. And this is then somehow enlarging the exportable goods and increasing the trade capacity for the country. However, as you know, as I mentioned to you, the international trade and the international transactions between the countries, and not only the final goods, but also intermediate goods such as energy and inputs, are also traded between the countries, especially in the so-called threefold decades. They have this energy crisis and they have this foreign energy usages in the market for the developed and emerging economies. And this is then becoming very important issue for the development or for this inflation issue. Because when you are increasing the inflation and expecting to enlarge the export, on the other side, your exportable goods, which is going to be produced in the market or in the domestic market, will become expensive for you, because if you are using foreign energy, foreign input for producing these goods and services, then the input prices or semi-finished goods and services will become expensive to import and use or process it to final good or finished goods to then export to the other destinations. This is then bilaterally a problem for the economy, because on the one side, it is believed that cheaper products will enlarge the market capacity in the international platform or international markets, and on the other side, depreciation of the currency or domestic currency will cause too much to the economy, because you are not able to buy these semi-finished or intermediate goods and services for producing final goods or finished goods. And also the reserve amount in the economy will become expensive. It will become a problem to the whole financial system, because as much as your currency become depreciated and become cheaper and lower valued, then you have to have more domestic currency, or let's say your own currency, national currency, to buy foreign currency. And over the period of time, then your currency will become cheaper and depreciate more, much more than the foreign currency, which is appreciated over the time. And then you need always more money to buy this reserve. And these are the problems of the economy. And from this point of view, the aggregate demand, if it is because of inflation reduced or some recession on the aggregate demand is observed, this will then create some problem to the whole economy. And as you see here, it is indicated on the figure or on the graphic, the aggregate demand curve, as it is indicated, the inflation and the real GDP is on the x-axis and inflation on the y-axis. And as much as the inflation is higher, the aggregate demand, this right angle triangle shows the consumer surplus. And as much as this inflation is increased and enlarged, this consumer surplus going up and up and up and becomes smaller for this triangle, this right angle triangle becomes smaller for the consumer welfare. And at the end, this will become zero. Therefore, inflation is not good for the whole economy because since most of the many people are consumers and only let's say 10% of the population are entrepreneur and having some startup business or having some firm or company for producing or joining to the production operation process, then the rest of the people or the citizens will be hurt by this inflation because inflation steadily reduced. It is increasing the prices and enlarging this gap in the economy and reducing the welfare for the consumers. Therefore, as much as this right angle triangle shifted up because of this price increase or inflation, you see this right angle triangle becomes smaller, and this is not good for the economy because welfare or the social economical effects for the community is becoming affected. If you are questioning why aggregate demand is downward sloping, of course it is downward sloping because the relationship between inflation and real GDP is negatively related, as it is indicated here. While you are increasing the inflation, the real GDP, amount of the GDP or amount of the goods and services which is produced in a year, is decreasing. As you see, the price going up, the inflation is up. I can show you here. As much as you shift this price up, you see the amount of the product is going backward. Therefore, this shifts on the prices, reducing. If it is here, then it is reduced to here. If it is going here, then it is reduced to aggregate demand and also production capacity here. If it goes here, then it goes, as you see, this is the declination of the real GDP. And as much as it's going up, this right angle triangle becomes smaller and smaller because, as you see, it is a larger one. And as much as the inflation is in the market, this going up and reduce and become smaller, and this is not good for the whole economy. If you have any question, you can ask me, please. And this is then the reason because inflation is in the market and real balance effect. It is says then because higher prices reduce the real spending power. As I said, purchasing power parity of the consumers is becoming smaller, and prices and the output are negatively related because I show you the relationship between inflation or so-called the price and the quantity is negatively related. And the foreign purchases effect is also issue, as I mentioned to you, the exchange rate is negatively affecting, as I have mentioned in the beginning of the lecture. When domestic prices are high, as you know, because of the inflation, we will export less to foreign buyers, and we will import more from foreign producers. Therefore, higher prices leads to a less domestic output. This is the expected. And due to this reason, in the exportable goods market, it is expected the domestic goods and services will become cheaper, not higher, not expensive. And the interest rate issue is also inflation is directly related to the inflation and interest rate. And as you know, the Fisher equation says the real interest rate is equal to nominal interest rate minus inflation, which means nominal interest rate is expected to become similar or must be equal to the inflation. And nominal interest rate and inflation, if it is equal, then this will then consolidate the, let's say, decrease of the currency, or let's say prevent the value of the currency. And if it is not realized, if we say you have 30% inflation and you have 15% interest rate, then you will in a year reduce your purchasing power of this capital or this loanable funds that you put into the market or put into the financial system or to the banking sector, will become 15% lesser, because between nominal interest rate and inflation, if there is a negativity or negative relationship, if inflation is 30 and interest rate, nominal interest rate is 15, as I said to you, 15 minus 30, if the inflation is 30, then you have minus 15, which means the real interest rate will be at the end of a year, if it is for 1 year or short period of time, it is saved in the banking sector, then this will give you 15% lesser capital, although this capital is in nominal value, is in monetary value, will be enlarged. Let's say you have $1,000 and you put to the bank, and you will get at the end of the period $1,150, let's say Turkish lira, because Turkish lira is depreciating very heavily. But if the inflation is 30%, and you have to subtract 30%, which is 300 Turkish lira must be subtracted from this given value, then this will then gives you 850 Turkish lira at the end of the year is the real purchasing power of this money. And if I'm going to make it simplified for being able to understand, with let's say an amount of any product, let's say bread, if you are buying with 1,000 Turkish lira 100 bread, and after a year you are only able to buy 90 bread, this is the indication of the inflation. Or if you are going to buy 70 bread, then this is then the indication that you are lowering your currency. And even if this inflation and the interest rate is subjected in the market, then this is similarly affecting. As I said to you, you will get 1,150 Turkish lira, but in purchasing power parity, as I said to you, if it is 30% the inflation, then you have to reduce 30% of this capital, which is 1,000, then you will have 850, because you are getting at the end of the period minus 15 for this capital that you invested to the bank or saved to the bank for a year. Therefore, these differences are becoming very important in the economy, because your wealthiness and your capital will become smaller and smaller in everyday life if you don't consolidate, and if you don't cover this loss with the reasonable interest rate, which is the nominal interest rate, so-called the political interest rate. And the results of this, your capital will become cheaper and will become depreciate, and this is not good for the economy, because cheaper and devaluated currency will always affect the whole economy as a whole, as a whole nation's activities, and this is then the problem in the long run, because as you are observing, for example, Turkish lira from 2020 to 2023 is heavily depreciated from 7, 8, let's say euro or $1 was 6 or 7 some, and now is approaching to 20. Therefore, this is showing that 3 times or threefold of this, let's say, capital that you are able to buy. Let me finish. You are able to buy in 2020. Now you are not able to buy with threefold of this Turkish lira, because you have to spend 20 Turkish lira to buy €1 or $1 approximately, let's say, if I'm going to roughly say. But in 2020, it was only 7 or somehow Turkish lira. Do you have any question, please?
Not hocam, it's accidentally I touched the switch on the voice.
Yeah. Okay, no problem.
Hocam, I don't have any questions.
Okay. You are understanding what I am approaching and spending for you and explaining to you. And when we look to the aggregate supply, this is then the other side of the economy, which is the supply side of the economy, because demand side is aggregate demand and supply side is the aggregate supply in the nation's level activities. And the supply or aggregate supply is the level of real domestic output available at each possible price level, which is the amount of the goods and services produced in a year. This is then the GDP, so-called the gross domestic production. And we are always calculating this in nominal terms, in monetary values, which is also a problem for the economy. You have to calculate this aggregate supply or the GDP or gross domestic production in real term. Therefore, real GDP estimation is always preferable. And for this reason, we are using deflator, the GDP deflator, for correcting these differences, disparities between the nominal GDP and real GDP. We are observing here the Keynesian, classical, and intermediate range, which is given here. As you see, the Keynesian economics is this aggregate supply is supposed to be the price is becoming fixed somehow. In classical, it is somehow not affected, not affected from these changes because it is somehow vertical. And in the between Keynesian and classical, we prefer to use intermediate range where it is somehow that's neither vertical nor horizontal. It is somehow slightly intersect the origin, let's say, as it is the supply curve realized for showing how the price and the GDP is, or the inflation and GDP or the gross domestic production is affected. Because I mentioned we can consider the Keynesian approach or classical also either, but in the end of the day, we know that the price changes positively affecting the supply side. Therefore, price increase has also meant the profit, and this will then affect and change positively the production operation process and enlarge the supply in the economy. And if this is not, then the opposite is expected. And from this point of view, we are always preferring to put this aggregate supply somehow not neither vertical nor horizontal, and somehow it is crossing a line to the X and Y. And this will then shows how this is related, which is positively related between this inflation and real GDP. And it is, of course, opposite case for the aggregate demand, because in the aggregate demand we have negatively related inflation and real GDP, or the price and the GDP, or the so-called the total amount of produced goods and services, is then expected to be from demand side is negatively affected when the price going up or the inflation is in the market. The ranges of aggregate supply then, as I have illustrated on the graphic, then can be summarized as the Keynesian range, as a large amount of unemployment make it so that the increase in aggregate demand have no effects on wages or prices. So this has meant the unemployment make it so that it increase aggregate demand, and this will then it's assumed and suppose there is no impact to the price or the wages in the Keynesian approach. It is in the short run maybe acceptable, and the classical range full employment, it's so that because it is supposed that the full employment is always, then in aggregate demand only increase wages or the prices, either wages or, because as you know, if the price is going to be shifted to the higher level, then the price increase has also means the producer has higher prices and higher profit. And when the price is going up, this will then it is expected to positively affect and enlarge the employment. This is how it is supposed to be. As you know, with the Phillips curve is also defined. As much as you shift the prices in the short run, of course, but in the long run it's not. Then in the short run, it is shifted to the up, and it is expected if the wages rate is intact, then this will then shift the employment. And intermediate, or if it is then not, then it is supposed to be, then it will shift the wages to the upper level. Therefore, in any cases, price increase, if it is reflected to the production operation process and the factors of production of which the employee will be affected, then this will then, let's say, happily, wages will become higher. And this is the reason why in Germany, in Europe, European countries, the higher wages is given because the productivity is high. The delta Q over delta L or delta Q over delta K, the productivity of capital or productivity of labor, as much as it is becoming enlarged and increased, this will then shift, or it is also expected to reflect it is expected to reflect to the wages, to the salaries, for enlarging and increasing the, let's say, productivity. Because as much as you are satisfying your employee and you give them more wages and higher salaries, then they will become more happily enjoy to work and increase their productivity. And from this point of view, this is how it is realized in the approach. And in the intermediate range, some sectors of the economy reach full employment, as it is mentioned, and more quickly than the others. And from this point of view, some will then reflect it to the wages and shift the economy and productivity to the higher positions, and some probably will not heavily affected from these changes, and then this is then not reflected to the whole market or some sectors which is in the market. And if we are questioning the variables which is affecting and shifting the aggregate demand, we are observing the tax, the interest rate, the confidence, the strength of the dollar, or consider, let's say, the domestic currency, because these are the books that we are always teaching from the United States, and the government spending. One by one, if I am going to explain you this, the taxes, this is also in Keynesian economics similarly. If the taxes employed and or reduced or deducted from the income from disposable income, let's say 10%, you will get, if you are getting $1,000, you will get $900. If it is 20%, you will get $800. Therefore, these taxes, as you see, tariff measures affecting the demand capacity, the purchasing power parity from this point of view will be affected, because taxes somehow is a burden on the consumer demand, and it is reducing it. If it is higher, as much as the tax rate is up, then the aggregate demand is expected to become smaller. And the interest rate, similarly, if the interest rate is up, then it is also expected that the inflation is in the market, and if the interest rate is higher, this has meant the price will then become higher, and this is also negatively affecting the aggregate demand. The confidence is also the reliability of the market structure and the other speculative activities is also affecting and changing the aggregate demand. If it is, let's say, somehow negatively affecting the aggregate demand or the consumers approach, let's say, if I say the interest rate is going to be increased next month, then people reduce their spending or demand capacity and prefer to save, or vice versa is also possible. And if the dollar or the, let's say, Turkish lira is becoming more powerful and appreciated, then this is then positively affecting the market structure for the consumers in the market, and vice versa for the foreigners. And the government spending also, if the government spending is increased, this is then positively affecting and enlarging the demand capacity, and vice versa is also considered. Here it is also given on the table. As you see, the variables that mention tax, interest rate, confidence, domestic currency, and government spending. And these are the determinants which is affecting the aggregate demand. As you see, the effects of on the GDP, the components are C plus I plus G plus NX. This is then NX, you know, C is the consumption, I is the investment, G is the governmental expenditures, and X is the net export, which means export minus import. If it is positive, then it's good for the economy. If it is negative, then it's not good for the economy. And governmental spending, as I mentioned to you, as much as increased and enlarged is positively or negatively. Then when we are going to look to the taxes, is affecting consumption and investment, as I mentioned to you. If this is supposed to be effects on the GDP is realized and the GDP components increase and becomes appreciated, as it is mentioned, the consumption and investment, this will then cause some decrease on the aggregate demand. And when we are going to the interest rates, similarly, the consumption investment is subjected, then this will then again, when the components is become appreciated, then this will then cause some decrease on the aggregate demand. And when we look to the confidence for the consumption investment, if the components is becoming these components, I mean this C and I or consumption investment, then this will then decrease the aggregate demand or is supposed to be equalized. And the confidence, if it is increase again, then this will then cause some increase on the aggregate demand. And for the domestic currency, if this is subjected for the net export, then this will supposed to be an increase realized on this component. Then this will cause some decrease on the exportable goods, but increase the import, and results of this, the aggregate demand is supposed to be reduced. And when we are looking to the governmental spending, the governmental spending, which is represented with G, is supposed to be increased or appreciated, and this will then cause some increase on the G, governmental spending or expenditure, and the results of this aggregate demand is supposed to be become enlarged, because governmental spending is the consumption, is spending, is then expected to enlarge and increase the governmental spending. And when we look to the other side, effects on the aggregate demand, when GDP component decreases now, then the tax is supposed to be, the impact of the taxes on consumption and investment is supposed to be increased, and then aggregate demand is enlarged. And if you go to the interest rate, if it is supposed to be consumption investment is then decreased, and then it goes to increase and enlarge the aggregate demand. When we look to the consumption, sorry, confidence, then this will also cause some increase, sorry, decrease on the component, and results of this, then aggregate demand will become smaller or decrease. Domestic currency is similarly, which is the net export, is subjected in the components, then this will then increase export and decrease import, and results of this then enlarge the aggregate demand, because it's positively affecting, as you see, export is increasing and import is reducing, and results of this, export minus import, is becoming positive for the economy. As you see, the balance of payment will become positively affected, and the aggregate demand is supposed to be positively reflected. And the governmental spending, when we look here, then again, is supposed to be the component as it is decreasing, then this will then cause some aggregate demand reduction. And the figure is also showing here, as I mentioned to you, while the price in the Keynesian is not affected, which is fixed somehow, it is indicated on the horizontal axis on the aggregate supply, and in the intermediate period it is going up, and we suppose always we are working on the aggregate demand, and aggregate demand shifts realized in the intermediate period of time, and the real GDP shifts during this period of time, which is considered our economy always moving and activating around this curve. And if it is becoming vertical, which is not affected from this price and inflation changes, then this is then the classical as it is mentioned, but we are considering these changes on the real GDP has been affected and changed regarding to these activities in the intermediate period of time, and the aggregate demand also shifted to the upper level results of these price changes and becoming enlarge and increase the real GDP from let's say equilibrium to the higher position. And it is also here indicated if the price changes is negatively affected and reduced the aggregate supply, which is normal to reduce, because as much as the aggregate supply results of this price decrease or results of this price changes, which is negatively move to the downward, then this will then reduce and become smaller. And at the end of the day, aggregate demand is also shifted to the lower level, and which is in the economy is supposed to be the equilibrium moves from lower position to real GDP dash. And when we consider the variables that shifts the aggregate supply, then the input price, productivity, and government regulation is subjected. Then you are understanding input price is heavily affecting and changing, as I mentioned to you in the beginning of our class. The input price, especially the intermediate goods or semi-finished goods, which is going to be used or processed in the economy or in the production operation process, then will become affected, because if the input price become appreciated, let's say energy prices or some other inputs which is going to be imported from foreign countries, this will then affect and change the aggregate supply also, and the productivity will become also affected from these changes. As much as your, let's say, employee performance or productivity is becoming higher, the expected output, the production operation process will become higher. If it is opposite, vice versa, reduced, then is becoming affected and reduced, now then lower level. And the government regulation is also, let's say, tax regulation, taxation, exportation facilities, or let's say support on subsidies given, these things, and everything which is affecting and changing the aggregate supply, devaluating currency or some other economical, let's say, measures which directly affect the aggregate supply, will then reduce this aggregate supply in the positive or in the negative direction, whether it is positively affecting, because, for example, if the tax law change and removed or, let's say, reduced for the producer, then this will then positively affect the aggregate supply. But if it is increased to 20% or 30% or 40%, then this will then affect again the aggregate supply negatively, because the financial inabilities or problem will cause some aggregate supply reduction. And from this point of view, when we are looking to the table again, if the input price increased, then it is expected, because of the expensive inputs, decrease the aggregate supply, or vice versa. If the input price decrease, this will then cause to aggregate supply to shift higher, to enlarge. And the productivity, if it is supposed to be increased, then this will then cause, of course, productivity is the labor productivity or capital productivity. If a person produce more in an hour, let's say if one person produce 10 unit, and after a year becomes 20 unit, because it becomes performance increase or use better technology or better, let's say, machineries for producing higher, then this productivity enlarge and increase the aggregate supply positively, or vice versa. If the productivity decrease in capital, also if the capital usage is reduced and affect the aggregate supply negatively and decrease. And the government regulations, as I have mentioned to you about the taxations or similar, let's say, measures or activities from the government, if it is positively reflected as the tax law reduction, this will then cause some increase. And if it is then negatively, then this will then cause decrease on the aggregate supply. And as you see here, now then the aggregate supply curve shifted now from, let's say, because of this price changes, from the equilibrium, which is indicated with the P star, and real GDP, let's say, star, moves and enlarge to the upper positions, because supply is supposed to be enlarged in the given direction and given graph. And here is then the negatively price increase, or the input price or something. Then this will then cause, as you see, the real GDP equilibrium price and equilibrium position moves to the upward and reduce, of course, the supply negatively. And when we look to the causes of the inflation, there is also demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Demand pull inflation is the inflation caused by an increase in the aggregate demand, which I mentioned to you. It is because of the demand capacity enlarge and increase, because people want to buy more, but the available goods and services is not sufficient. Therefore, this will then shift the prices to the higher level, as it is in the pandemic period. If you remember, the toilet papers and some other, let's say, hygienic materials, the disinfectant and everything becomes more appreciated, or gloves, hand gloves that we are using becomes very appreciated and very expensive because demand was high. And the cost push inflation, this is then decrease in the aggregate supply because you produce less, let's say, every seasonal watermelon and melon prices in the summer becomes differently. One season becomes very cheap, the other season becomes expensive. This is because of the aggregate supply, because supply is dependent to the price changes of the year. If the price is becoming high, the supplier or the producer become motivated, accelerated, and becomes more, let's say, desire to produce more for getting more profit. And when these desire and production capacity enlarge, increase the price, increase the production and reduce the price in the next season. Therefore, demand is dependent to the former side for current price and current market structure, but supply is dependent to the former period or production capacity. And from this point of view, when this aggregate supply is in the market and it is decreasing because of any production reduction, and the price is expected to going up, and vice versa. If there is an abundant, let's say, watermelon or melon in summer, then the price is expected to go down. And this is how it is affecting and changing the market structure in the supply side, and the demand side is simply introduced to you. And the government, which is the, let's say, another participant to the aggregate demand, is also important to know. The role of the government in economic activities is, as I mentioned to you, directly related with tax policies, the government spending, and the interest, because these are all based and dependent to the government regulations. Taxes, government spending, and interest rate, the nominal interest rate we are talking about. Therefore, as you know, in Turkey, there is a fundamentalist government, and they are always refusing this Islamic because of Islamic reason, because they believe interest is haram, is forbidden, and it is not good for employing. Therefore, they are trying to remove this interest from the agenda, but on the other side, they are putting some other consolidated, let's say, measures for being able to increase the amount of the saving capital. And from this point of view, if the government set the taxes very high for the, let's say, disposable income, the consumers who are ready to save part of their disposable income will probably reduce their saving or will probably not able to save. Or vice versa, this tax, which is going to be subjected for the borrowers, for the investors, if it is very high, then they are not able to realize their businesses and enlarging their, let's say, production operation process. In Cyprus, for example, most of the startup business or small to medium-sized enterprises are usually becomes bankrupt, and they are trying to refuse paying taxes to the government, or the taxes which is demanded from the government is somehow reflected to the other directions because of the reasons they don't have any profit, they are not able to perform their economical existence, or they are not able to maintain their production operation process. And these are the reasons that they are not able to pay the tax, or opposite, the government impose higher taxes, and because of these higher taxes, they are not able to perform their production operation process sufficiently. This is bilaterally affecting and changing the economic activities and the aggregate demand, of course, because if it is reducing activities, increasing taxes and reducing the economic activities, this will then reduce also aggregate demand, or vice versa, is also reducing the similarly aggregate demand and aggregate supply, as well as, which is at the end of the day, bilaterally, the economical recession is in the market. And government spending also, as I mentioned to you, if it is increased and enlarged, this will then cause some deficit in the economy. This will then enlarge the public services and public spending. And at the end of the day, this will then cause some debt problem. And when the debt problem is in the market, then the financial inabilities and financial problems and capital problems arise. And this is then, of course, reduce the financial ability of the people or the financial system to support and enlarge the investors and the entrepreneurs in the market. And also interest rate, if it is high, as I said to you, it is good for the savers, but it is not good for the borrowers. Therefore, on the one side, there is savers, on the other side, there is borrowers, and you are not able to manage bilaterally these parties. If you reduce the interest rate for the savers, the amount of the saving capital will become smaller. And if you increase the interest rate for the borrowers, then they will give up to borrow some capital for realizing some internet investment and some economic activities. Therefore, these are not good things for the economy as a whole, and these are all affecting negatively the aggregate demand and also aggregate supply in the market. When we look to the government influences the aggregate supply, which is also parallelly enlarge and increase the market combined together, government can influence the economic activities with aggregate supply side policies, which is affecting the input cost, labor and wages, reducing the regulations, as I mentioned, for the tax regime, and the increased incentives to work, to take risks. And these things are all affecting the supply side of the economy. When we go step by step again, the labor and wages, if the input costs, energy and some other factors which is affecting and changing the labor capacity, if the minimum wage is set high, the amount of the people will become lower, because higher wages, higher minimum wages is supposed to be reduce the desire of the, as you see every year, the labor unions and the government sit on a table for discussing the minimum wage. And when the minimum wage is high, the labor unions, these are always high, but the employers reduce and refuse this demand because they said if it is too high, then we will release some workers from our job places. Therefore, they are trying to become compromises for managing and balancing the wages, also called the minimum wages, which is the people's, let's say, salary in the most of the businesses and most of the firms and companies. Therefore, these regulations that is determined by the government or the parties or the organs is affecting wages, is affecting the labor, unemployment, employment, higher wages, lower wages, welfare. These are become affected. These regulations also, which is mentioned also and included to the taxes, are all affecting the supply. As I mentioned, if tax regime is high, the supply is becoming affected because if you put higher taxes or higher, let's say, duty for the produced goods and services and demand more or importation or exportation, then this will then reduce, putting some supply side, some barriers and reducing the production operation process in the economy. Therefore, the government must facilitate and increase and enlarge the economical activities because economical activities is good because it is the, let's say, engine of the economy. It is increasing and enlarging the GDP and growth, and therefore it must not be with, let's say, some sanctions and some barriers. It must be removing the barriers and sanctions for facilitating this development. And incentives also, as I said to you, for working conditions, let's say labor unions, working conditions, the hours, the transportations, feedings, hospitality, everything, the healthcare, the schooling, everything, or au pair, the things which is offered in the let's say, production in the sector where the supply realize must be sufficient for supporting the productivity. And these things are all affecting and changing the whole economy and the whole system, because if you go to the developed nations, you are observing there are too many kindergarten, there are too many supports for the let's say employees for relaxing and working better, for delivering better performance to increasing the productivity. They are offering better conditions, meals, let's say, salaries and healthcare, and everything is given, transportations. These things are accelerating and increasing this supply and, of course, the productivity and the economical performance. Therefore, these are the important things in the economy for considering for better off or comparing and performing better economical, let's say, activities in the international platform. Today I introduce you these aggregate demand and aggregate supply, a little bit from the Keynesian, a little bit from the classical. Step by step, as I said to you, I will start to give you some more models and some more calculations to see how these models and parameters are affecting and changing, and if the tax policy is changed or if the government policy is changed, how it is affecting. We will then put some numerical examples over the time for being able to determine and understand how to perform better economical, let's say, structure, and how to perform the economy in the, let's say, international platform or in the nations level activities, because economical activities and the performance of the economy or the people or the firms is important, and we have to know how to perform and enlarge the profit. What is the cost and benefit of the firms is going to be analyzed step by step in the lectures, and I will develop you the Keynesian model and then solo give you to see how it is affecting and enlarging the, let's say, better economic conditions. If you have any question, you ask me. If you don't, then I will stop here.
Thank you, hocam. No questions.
Then
Thank
next
you,
week,
hocam.
then we will continue with these things until we are coming to the, let's say, calculations for making you more, let's say, competitive in macro. And the exam, I will give you some classical, some theoretical, and some calculations together. If we are able to reach to the applications within 1 or 2 weeks, I think time we have the time for finishing this Keynesian. If not, then we will then after the midterm. Okay, then see you then next week. I have
Okay,
another
hocam.
class then. Okay, then see you then. Bye
Thank
bye.
you, hocam. Thank you. Bye bye.